headshot, so they can't see you.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to turn off the audio. I can't hear you either. Yeah. That'll be good. All right, Bonnie, you are ready to rock. When?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. My name is Bonnie Battaglia, and I'm the development director here at BNC. It was so nice seeing everybody picking up their meal today. I hope you're home enjoying a delicious dinner. Your ticket purchase and your participation directly supports the mission of BNC and our culinary program, and we thank you for that. Tonight's demo, we actually will do a fun. We have a live chat section. So right hand side of your screen, please post comments and ask questions to Chef Andrew, and they will be answered with the help of Ryan Weber of Ryan Weber Marketing. So I guess without further ado, Chef Andrew.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to have an awful lot of fun tonight. St. Patrick's Day is a very widely celebrated holiday in this country, and by stroke of luck, we happen to have our demo falling right around that time this year. So without further ado, here we go. Our first course tonight was a sausage roll. For all intents and purposes, this is basically a kind of fancy pig in a blanket. The assembly is very easy. You just get an Irish banger or any kind of sausage you want, really. And you take it, you roll it up into a piece of puff pastry. If you can, just crimp the corners at the end. Doesn't get much easier than that. Before it goes in the oven, just brush it with a little bit of melted butter, and it'll come out nice and golden and delicious. Puff pastry is kind of finicky. You definitely want to cook it at a high temperature so that the layers can expand and get nice and fluffy. So the trick is balancing the temperature so that the puff pastry expands without actually burning the outside. So 400 to 425 degrees is a great temperature range for this. If you have a convection oven, I recommend you use the convection fan and use a slightly lower temperature. So with our sausage roll this evening, is it morning or evening? We served a couple of accompaniments with it. I hope you enjoyed the beer mustard. That one's a fairly easy recipe. You basically just soak the mustard seeds overnight and then add them to the rest of your ingredients that you bring to a boil, puree in a blender, and let chill until it's ready to go. The other thing that we did was pick the vegetables. And this one is just a little bit more in depth. So you want to start by making sure your vegetables are roughly uniform in thickness. So you want your peppers, your cucumbers, your green beans. What else do they put in here for me? Your carrots, all roughly the same thickness, so that the brine penetrates them at the. One of the tricks to making really good pickles is to make sure your vegetables are as cold as possible when you add the very hot brine to them. This is how you get your pickles to be really, really crisp when you finish. I've got our briny liquid all ready to boil here. And I'm just going to pour every single bit of this right over my vegetables. I want to make make sure that you have enough brine to completely submerge your vegetables. If you have a container that's a little bit bigger, like this one is, you probably want to put something inside it to weigh it down so that all the vegetables are completely submerged in the brine. Insert this step, you let this cool to room temperature, cover it most of the way, put it in the refrigerator. Pickles are ready as soon as they're cold. For best results, you wait 3 days, you'll get the maximum flavor retention from your pickle. Moving right along, now we're getting to the fun stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about one of the ingredients in your meal today. You have something in there that's called paint curing salt. This is not a seasoning. I do want to take a few moments to discuss this because this is probably the most dangerous ingredient in your kitchen. This is sodium nitrate salt. It's used extensively for curing meats. You apply this to a pork belly before you smoke it to make bacon. This is a very high-strength preservative, and it needs plenty of time to work itself into whatever you're using. Very, very small amounts of this do a number on whatever you're curing. My usual ratio for a 12-pound pork belly to make bacon is about a teaspoon. Now, for our briskets, I use the same amount, even though the pieces that I brine to make this corned beef were a little bit smaller. I use a teaspoon for a 5-pound piece of meat. The curing salt is the reason why corned beef gets the color that it does. And you won't see that color change if you're making corned beef from scratch until you actually cook it. I sure hope there's a trash can down there. So here we have a Texas brisket. For people who don't know, this is called a Texas brisket because I brought this back from Texas the last time I went there. Got it from a grocery store called H-E-B. With all apologies to Food Lion and Harris Teeter, H-E-B is the best grocery store out there. Changed my mind. So when we take a whole brisket and we want to process this for corned beef, what you want to do is you want to separate the two muscles here. On the bottom of the piece of brisket, you see the main muscle. This is called the flat, and this is the one that's very widely available. If you go to a grocery store, this is generally what they're going to sell. On top of the flat, you take a look at this piece of fat right here. This separates the top muscle on the brisket, which is called the point. If you know Texas-style barbecue, the flat of the brisket is what's called lean brisket, and the point is called moist brisket or fatty brisket. When you smoke it, you're going to want to keep this together, but you want to cut out enough of the fat in between the two muscles so that you're able to lay it flat. So if you're making corned beef out of this, you do want to separate the two muscles. They're roughly the same size once you get them apart. So they cook at the same rate more often than not. One of the things that you are going to want to do when you're working with a brisket is you're going to want to even out the fat cap on top of it. A lot of the stuff doesn't really look very good anyway. You want to leave some of it on there because it helps protect and insulate the meat during the cooking process. But you don't want so much on there that people are just going to be eating massive amounts of fat. Now, this brisket is pretty well trimmed. I don't really have to do a whole lot to this one. I bought this one fabricated deckle out. The deckle is a big piece of fat that runs right here in between the point and the flat. In Texas, you can buy briskets trimmed up in ways at the local grocery store. As an aside, it also costs roughly the same amount at the grocery store in Texas as I would pay wholesale here in North Carolina. This deckle fat, you can cut wedges of it out to get the brisket to lay just a little bit more evenly if you're going to cook it fully. But the main thing when you're doing corned beef is once you separate the muscles, You know, just make sure that you do have that fat cap evenly trimmed up. So this really doesn't need a whole lot. So we're going to get all this ugly stuff off and call it a day. Not too far. I'm going to go ahead and move this one aside because I'm actually going to throw this on my smoker. I'm going to pull out a brisket flat that's already been trimmed. You can see the layer of fat is relatively even all the way across. Not a whole lot on there. I would say maybe half a centimeter tops. For corned beef, that's about as much fat as you want to leave on. The next step is to make your brine. Kind of started on the stove over here. Now we have a little bit of a different procedure when we're making our brine for our corned beef as opposed to our pickles. We're going to dissolve our salt and our sugar and our spices into a liquid. We pour this hot liquid over our raw brisket, what's going to happen? Well, that hot liquid is going to start cooking our brisket, and that's not something that we really want to have happen. So in order to combat that, I'm making my brine basically double strength. I'm using dissolving the salt and the sugar and the spices in half the amount of water that I want to use. And I'm going to have an equal amount of ice water on hand so that as soon as all my spices are dissolved, I just dump this amount of ice water into my brine, cools it down right away, and brings it to the proper dilution. I cheated a little bit. I got it. We've got our nice, really hot brine, got all the steam coming off of it. Dump some ice water into that. Bring that temperature right down. Now you do want to check and make sure that it is cool enough before you run your meat. I always recommend checking with a thermometer. A quick stir so the temperature evens out. And this liquid was at a boil less than 30 seconds ago. And now it is sitting at about 80 degrees, which is probably not hot enough to really cook anything. So at this point, you can put your brisket into a non-reactive container, pour your brine right over it. If there's still a little bit of ice in there that hasn't melted yet, that's fine. And then you're going to tightly cover it, and every 2 days you're going to flip it over until 9 or 10 days have passed, so this brine can thoroughly penetrate that piece of brisket. I lost my train of thought for just a moment. Once you brine your brisket, again, you flip it every other day. You don't have to have the level of the brine completely submerging the brisket. As a matter of fact, it's better if you don't. As long as it's coming up about halfway up the side, that's as much brine as you need. During the course of that 10 days, flipping the brisket over, you're going to get an awful lot of flavor working into that brisket. You really don't get the same result by buying a corned beef brisket in the grocery store because I'm pretty sure that those are just cured and they're not really spiced. And that's why they give you those little spice packets that go with them, so you can kind of get the flavor that it's really supposed to have. If you put that pickling spice blend into your brine, you're going to get so much more flavor. You pull out all those flavors from the clove and the allspice, a little bit of heat from mustard seed and the ginger, which from the smell of that brine, I think it's a little bit too much flavor. But if you have 10 days before St. Patrick's Day to do this, you will end up with a result that is far better than anything that you can buy. Let's get this out of our way. Have you had any questions so far?
No questions.
Wow, we're making it really easy on me.
They said they enjoyed the meal. They already ate it.
Well, since everybody has finished their meal, I guess we might as well come on to dessert. It's one of the really fun things that we do. A lot of our recipes. I like beer as an ingredient because it gives you a depth of flavor that's pretty unique. There's a lot of ways to use beers in recipes. You go by the same rule of thumb that you would with wine. If you wouldn't drink it, with a beer. So today I'm going to demonstrate how to make the stout chocolate cake that apparently everybody has already eaten. Start off with a bottle of beer, pot on the stove, turn the under that, throw our butter in there, and then all you really have to do is get that hot enough for your butter to mix. Go ahead and go over here and start working with our mixer. We're going to take our eggs, and we're going to take our sour cream, combine these two. Turn the mixer on and let these combine for about a minute or so. You want these to be pretty evenly mixed before you add any other ingredients. Mixer bowl. Speed on a little bit above low to get started. We'll let that run for just a few moments. While we wait for our butter to melt. Help the butter melt along. Stirring the liquid while you're trying to melt the butter will also keep the liquid from getting too hot. It'll be important in a few minutes because we're going to add it to the batter relatively soon after we're done with this process. Once the butter gets about halfway melted, I'm going to just go ahead and kill the heat and let the residual heat in the liquid melt the butter the rest of the way. Getting there. Right over here. It's a lot harder to use a mixer when the controls are on the outside. About that. And straight down the bowl, try to really combine as possible. Just going to do this a little bit more. Stir it so our butter finishes up. While this is working in, I'm going to go ahead and take my cocoa powder, mix it into my beer and butter.
What would be the difference between different types of beer, like a stout or a porter or a light beer?
So stout beers have a lot more bitter flavors, which really complements chocolate very well, which is why I like to do stout or a porter with this particular recipe. We used an IPA. We used an IPA in the pickled vegetables just for a little bit of hoppiness that you get from IPAs. Not really looking for something tremendously bitter in your pickles, but what you do want is something that just increases the range of flavors that you get. Right? That pickle brine has a decent amount of sugar in it, so you could use a pretty hoppy IPA and not really have any any issues with the flavor profile. But if you're using something extremely hoppy, like say Bell's Hop Slam or Hop Drop and Roll from Noda here in Charlotte, you might want to just go up on the level of sugar just a little bit to help counteract that. All right, so now we have our chocolate liqueur here. It's the term that I use for the cocoa, the butter, and the beer. If you wanted to make this without beer, you could use this recipe just with water. You do lose a lot of interesting flavors here in the cake, unfortunately. If you've eaten the dessert already, you may have noticed that the cake itself is not really sweet, but the ganache and the caramel that goes with it, add all the sweetness that you need. So putting together a good dish like that is really all about contrast more than anything else. You want to have different flavors kind of competing with each other to make your flavors more interesting. All right, I think our butter is completely melted in here. I don't see any steam coming off of this, so that's probably a good sign that it's not going to cook our eggs. So we're going to go ahead and add this into our mixer. Get that nice and combined. Side here for a second, so it'll be easier for you to see.
The cake was a hit by far. It was everyone's favorite.
Thank you very much. I really like that recipe. I don't always do it as cupcakes. Usually I make whole cakes out of that one. But adjusting it for cupcakes was a lot of fun and something that we were able to troubleshoot with my culinary students earlier this week.
Nice.
One of the nice things about doing these events is that I do get to expose the students in my culinary program to some things that they wouldn't see on a normal basis in just your average restaurant kitchen. But we do try to make things from scratch as much as possible here, and that includes baking desserts. We're just about to get into our dessert portion of our class, actually, which is usually the one that the students enjoy more than anything else. I'm going to go ahead and combine all of my dry ingredients right here. Salt and make sure that they are evenly combined before we get to liquid phase of our batter. Without doing this, you may end up with lumps of sugar in your finished product. You might find that your cakes don't rise evenly. It just takes a couple of seconds. If you're really picky about it, you can sift your ingredients. This technique works fairly well for our intensive purposes. We're going to go ahead and actually add every single bit of this into my batter. I'm scooping it out with a measuring cup, so if I tried to pour it from this bowl into that, half of this would end up on the counter, and I'd have even more to clean up. Just a little bit left. Okay, we're going to turn our mixer back on, nice and low. I always recommend mixing cake batters at a very low speed because you don't want to overdevelop the gluten in the flour. You'll end up with a cake that's fairly tough, and that's a best case scenario. And if you overmix your batter too much, you'll end up with throughout your baked goods, be it your breads or your cakes, because the gluten structure is trapping the air bubbles in there that want to expand, which causes your cakes to rise. And if they're trapped too much, they'll just keep on trying to expand, and eventually they burst, and that's how you end up with big air bubbles inside of your baked goods. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you also don't want to undermix your cakes. You wanted to mix your cake batter enough so that the flour develops enough structure from the gluten to where it's going to hold its shape and stick together. If you mix your cakes, you'll end up with something that crumbles and kind of falls apart. You'll also end up with, in the case of cupcakes, you won't end up with a nice dome on the top of the cupcakes. Now, for what we did for this dessert was actually a little bit of a hybrid. I undermixed it just slightly so that the tops would flatten out. So once I flip it over, it looks kind of like a derby hat, like the leprechaun's hat. So a little something for the, just to get into the spirit of the holiday. Now I'm going to put this out of the way for just a moment. I want to take some time and scrape down everything on the inside of the bowl. That way we make sure that all of this gets mixed really, really well. So we just stirred this long enough to where everything looked combined. Now we're going to make sure that everything really is combined. All down to the bottom. Any flour that might be clumped down there. Any last bit of sour cream or egg that you need to get into your batter. Now we are going to go back into the mixer. I'm going to run this on low speed again for about another minute. And that's going to make sure that everything is nice and combined and finish developing the gluten structure that we need in the flour to make our cupcakes nice and good. So I have here a silicone baking mat. These things are absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend them. They're a little expensive, but they are an absolute pleasure to work with a silicone mat like this. You don't need any kind of non-stick spray, any kind of coating inside. These things will release our cupcakes pretty much perfectly as soon as they are ready. I think we'll probably have about 30 more seconds to go on this before this is going to be mixed enough. And what I usually look for in the mixer is, you want your mixed batter to have a really nice shine to it. If it looks a little bit dull, it probably needs to work just a little bit more. I can see the batter actually starting to pull away from the sides a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. Get every single bit of batter we can off of our whip attachment. Now we're going to go ahead and scoop this out into our mold. This disher is just a little between 2.5 and 3 ounces in volume. These indentations in my silicone baking sheet hold just a little bit of 3 ounces. When you're making cupcakes, you really want to not fill them up all the way. You want to make sure that you leave just a little bit of room for them to rise. If you do overfill them, you won't get a very clean and defined top. They want to spread before they really start developing structure. When you're scaling cake batter like this, it's very important to use a fairly precise measure. If you're measuring for full-size cake rounds, the difference of a tablespoon from one to the other isn't really going to make a huge difference. But in the case of cupcakes, it really will. You want to make sure that you have pretty close volume between these so that they're at the same rates. Going, fill everything up. I'm curious as to what people thought was the best part of the dessert. The cake, the ganache frosting, or the caramel that came with it. I really hope they say the beer caramel, because it was a real pain to make.
Caramel was a hit. I like it all. The ganache, but love the whole thing together. Apparently, it was just good.
All right. Very happy to hear that. I guess we'll do another one of these next time. Just gonna clean up the edges of our cupcake pan a little bit. Turn it around and throw it in our 350-degree oven. Hey Siri, set timer for 35 minutes. Thank you very much. Great, so you're not going to be able to see the end of the. You want to come back next week and grab another one? I have about 2 dozen ready to go. So before we leave you tonight, I'm going to leave you with one of the best jokes that I've ever heard in my life. An Irishman moves to New York City and finds a local bar in his neighborhood and starts frequenting it. And every time he goes in, he orders 3 pints of stout. After about a week, the bartender asks him, "Hey, why do you always order 3 pints at a time?" "Oh," said the Irishman, "this is for my brothers back home in Ireland. When I left, we told each other that every time we went into the pub, we'd order a pint for the other 2, so that we'd always think of each other." The bartender thought nothing of it. For 6 months, the Irishman keeps coming into the bar and ordering 3 pints of stout. And one day he comes in, and he only orders 2 pints of stout. The bartender goes over to him, delivers the 2 pints of stout, and says, "I'd like to offer you my condolences." "Oh, what do you mean?" said the Irishman. "Well, you told me the story about how you always raise a pint of stout for each of your 2 brothers, so I figured that one of them must have passed away." "Oh, no," said the Irishman. "No, my friend. I quit drinking." Have a nice night, everybody.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Ryan, for helping host. I hope you all enjoyed the evening. Definitely from the comments, I know you all enjoyed your meal. If you'd like to learn more about our culinary programs and the other community programs we offer, please visit our website or give me a call. So again, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your evening.